Good day and welcome to our session, Do you know where your data has been? My name is Dinah Coetzer and today I'm going to take you through some tools and tips in Excel on how to clean up your data prior to starting to analyze your data. So the first thing I'd like to show you is always remember to make a copy of your original data set. Too many times I've reworked data, finalized my analysis, and then realized somewhere along the line something went wrong and my data set doesn't agree anymore. So always make sure you make a copy, whether it's in the same workbook and you just insert a separate worksheet, mark it as original data set. What I like to do as well, I will then change the tab color so that I always make sure I don't work in that worksheet in my workbook. Alternatively, save it as a different workbook. When you're satisfied with your data and satisfied that everything matches, you can then remove the original data set. One of the key features that we tend to not focus on when we're working in Excel is doing a spell check. We must always remember that we've got different people that could potentially be contributing to the data that compiles our data set. And different people will always input data differently. So yes, we tend to do spell checks in PowerPoint, Outlook and Word, but we don't really do spell checks when it comes to working in Excel. So how do we do a spell check? We go to the Review tab, and inside the Review tab, we've got the Proofing, Grouping, and we've got Check Spelling. So the spell check works exactly the same as what spell check works in the rest of the Microsoft Office stack. But please remember to start off with making sure that your spelling in your document is correct. The next thing we need to remember is now that we've checked our spelling and we're satisfied with our spelling, is that if potentially we're copying and pasting data into our data set. So we're not working with something like Power Pivot to combine different data sets, or alternatively working with Power BI. We're actually copying data into the same data set to create one big data set. Sometimes it does happen that when we copy data sets, we incorrectly copy a line twice. So how do we make sure that we don't have duplicate values? We've got two options. The first option is, once again, going to the Data tab in the ribbon, then going to the Data Tools grouping, then we're going to go to Remove Duplicates. This will ask me in which of the columns must it check for duplicates. So if this is due to the fact that I've been copying data to compile a data set, I can actually leave all of them ticked, as this will mean that they're a duplicate in all of these columns. However, if I use the Data Remove Duplicates feature, this will automatically remove the duplicate lines. So if I now select OK, it's telling me, oh, there's no duplicate values found. So across all of these columns, there's none of the columns that have exactly the same data. Alternatively, I can also use a very nice other feature if I go to the Home tab and I use conditional formatting. So let's select our item 3 description. Now I'm going to go to conditional formatting, and under the highlight cell rules feature, I've got duplicate values. This will not delete my duplicate values, but this will, based on the condition, show me which are duplicate values. So now, if for instance this was a posting error and I were now to go and apply a change to this field, it will automatically remove it as a duplicate value. So two options: data, remove duplicate values, or alternatively, show me the duplicate values because I need to apply a change based on the duplicate values. Another very nice feature, let's quickly create an instance. So if we look at this, this is one of the spelling errors that I left in. I've got two ways of finding and replacing this incorrect input. So if this wasn't a spell check, this was just the input field that I want to change to create a consistency, for instance. I've got two options. I like to, when I've created my data set, add filtering in my data set, because now when I go through my data set, I can quickly see if there's anything that looks out of the norm. So for instance, in this one, if I wasn't supposed to have blanks, I will now know there's a problem in this column. Dates is fine. Reference is fine. If we now go to transaction description, you'll see I've got 3 different instances of purchases. So if I now want to find this value, I'm first of all going to copy this value, Control C. I'm then going to go to Control F to find this, Control V to paste it. So now what I've inputted there is the same as what I've got on my data set. And I now want to replace this with the correct value, which is purchase order. I can now opt to replace all, and it will correct all of them and tell me how many replacements it's found. So this is a nice feature, for instance, if I don't want to use the word purchase order anymore. If, for instance, I want to change the word purchase order to just purchases, I can now once again Control C to copy, Control F to find, Control V to paste. I'm now going to replace this, and I want to replace this with purchases. Replace all. And now it's made 85 replacements. So Control Find and Replace is quite an ideal feature when we want to replace data in our data set to ensure consistency. Another very nice feature is if I don't use the shortcut keys, I can also go from a ribbon perspective. So I'm going to go to the Home tab in my ribbon. I'm then going to go to the Editing grouping, and inside the Editing grouping, I've got the same option to find and replace, and the feature looks exactly the same as what I used on my shortcut key. One of the most important things that we must remember is when we work with data sets, Excel does not like blank values. So when we create pivot tables, VLOOKUPs, etc., blank values in rows or blank column headings tends to distort the analysis of our data set. So how do I identify when I have blank values and address this? So if we look at the item description column, It's not problematic because I potentially would have blank values in my rows, but my column does have a heading, so I'm fine with that. But if I look at my key columns, which would be my quantity and my cost. If I look at my quantity, I potentially would not have blank values in my quantity because otherwise this line would actually add no value. So how do we find the blank cells in our data set, especially when we're working with very big data sets? I can once again either go to my filter option at the top. I can then go and find my blank values so that I can focus only on my blank values, which will now show me my 2 blank values. Alternatively, I can use this very nice feature. So first of all, this is the column that we're focusing on. We've also got 2 options to find our blank cells. First of all, shortcut. So I'm going to use Control and G. If I now go in Go To the Special tab, I can select blanks and it will only show me the blanks in my data set. Let's do that again, but let's do it now from a ribbon perspective. So this is the column that I'm focusing on. So from a ribbon perspective, we're going to go to our Home tab. We're going to go to our Editing Grouping. And inside our Editing Grouping, we're going to go to Find and Select. And the same feature, now we're going to go to Special. Go to Special, put our blanks. We're saying, show us only the blanks. So now you'll see that these 2 fields are now highlighted. I can now also go, depending on how big my data set is, if I now push Enter, Enter, it will move between the 2 highlighted fields and it will fill in the blanks so that if I now use my filter, I don't have blanks, I have zeros in my data set. So always remember to make sure when Excel is not giving you the answer that you expect it to give you, it's due to the data. So make sure that what we're asking Excel to do, always have all of our rows populated as well as all of our column headings. No open spaces in between data, because as soon as what we've got an open column, then Excel sees this as 2 data sets. As soon as what we've got an open row, Excel sees this as 2 data sets. So potentially if you're getting the wrong answer, it's because you're asking the question incorrectly. Let's now look at another very nice feature. If I have to think of working with external data sets, if I think of creating a bank reconciliation at the end of the month, and potentially I might have a Discovery card, I've got a First National card, bank check account, and potentially I might have a Standard Bank credit card. So for me to go and look at my actual spend, I would like to compile this into one data set so that I can then, according to that, go and add in expense categories so that I can see where am I actually spending my money. However, sad news, between all of the banks, and even if you just export data set in one bank, but the one is for a check account and the one is for a credit card, then how we get the data sets completely differ. So for the one, you'll have positives and negatives to show debits and credits, and for the other one, you'll have debits and credits in 2 different columns. For the one, you might have day, year, month, or month, day, year, For the other one, you'll have year, day, month. For the one, you'll have a single column with your description in. For the other one, you might have two separate columns with your description in. So especially when you work with something like bank statements, there's quite a lot of transacting and manipulating of the data. I don't like the word manipulating. It sounds like constructive accounting. But there's quite a lot of rework of the data prior to getting to an actual data set that we could potentially use to do analysis. So one of the key things is, normally you would potentially get the data in a CSV file, which means you would need to change this data set so that it would split it into columns. So you'd have to do a text to column. Alternatively, the other thing is, if you've now got your data set and you decide that potentially this column for the one data set is in two columns and for the other data set it's in one column. So you would either want to combine them or actually split them. Very nice feature is the fact that we could now go and in our data set, we'll go to the data tab. A lot of our rework is in the data tab. We can go to data tools, and in data tools, we can now use the feature text to columns. So what text to columns will do is, first of all, show me what my data set is. Next, it's going to ask me, what is the delimiter? And in our example, the delimiter here is a space. So I want Excel to split it where there is a space. As soon as I select space, you'll see it's indicating it at the bottom and saying I want this split into two columns. So now I'm going to say next and finish. You'll see it's now split this single column into two separate columns. So now we're closer to the point of getting our different data sets into the same format, look and feel, etc., so that we can start working on this data. One of the other very key features, and this will potentially not affect your analysis of the data, but once again, this will definitely affect how your data is perceived. So let's quickly make one or two changes here. The key thing here is, when we look at data, or the people that we're creating this analysis for are usually quite analytical, which means they're quite attentive to detail. So for us to give them data in an analysis where there's not a consistency in the data, it could mean that that person is more focused on the fact that there's no consistency in your data than on the actual data. So if we think, sometimes we get data sets where everything is in small letters, or everything's in capital letters, or there's a combination between capital and small letters. We need to get to a point where we create a consistency as to how we present our data. So a very nice formula for this is, if I want to change my data all to capital letters, I'm going to use the upper feature. You'll see Excel will automatically assume that due to the fact that I've inserted a column there, I would potentially want to do exactly the same to all of the data down below. Let me just increase the size a little bit and we'll see. So for the capital letters, I used upper, and I said I want to change this data to capital letters. If alternatively, I wanted to change this to small letters, I'll do the reverse and I'll do lower. Once again, Excel has picked up the consistency and it's changed all of my data sets at the bottom. If, for instance, I've got a combination, and I once again want to get a bit of a consistency, but I want to use proper grammar. I can use the proper feature, which is proper, and which data set do I want to change? Close the brackets. You'll see it's perfect. So all the first letters of each word is a capital letter and the rest of them are in lowercase. So this creates a nice clean consistency. Due to the fact that I inserted this column, what I usually do when I insert a manipulation column, because this is the column that I'm going to use to manipulate this data, I will usually highlight the column heading in a different color so that I always know which are my inserted manipulation columns. After I've manipulated the data and I'm satisfied with this data, I will now take the data which has got the formula in it. I will copy this data into the original data set and I'll paste it as a value, which means my highlighted manipulation column I can now remove. So why do I copy this as a value? As long as what I'm busy reworking, manipulating my data prior to analyzing my data, all formulas that I put in place, I will paste as a value. Because as I'm reworking my actual data set, it could potentially change the outcome of one of these fields. So to make sure that the future changes that you're doing while manipulating a data set doesn't affect past changes, rather copy paste them as values until you're satisfied with your data set, and thereafter you can now input the actual formulas that you require to do your analysis. One of the very sneaky little parts of Excel is the fact that when we import data from an external data source, we sometimes tend to, with the imported data, bring through non-printed characters. So if, for instance, I were to insert a space there, and a space there, and a space even at the back, and I'm looking at this massive data set, quickly fix that spelling, then by just looking at this massive data set, you can't really see that you've got trailing zeros in any of your words. However, if I were to use this data set to create a pivot table, so I'm going to go insert pivot table. Yes, I'm going to specifically select the reference, which was the field where we inserted some trailing zeros. Let's go back one. And you'll see that even though they're still misspelled, those two are exactly the same, and that one, as well as those two. When I look at them, for instance, those two, with my eye, I can't see that there's a difference. So potentially, my actual analysis is going to be incorrect. And it's easier perhaps to see when you're working with a smaller data set, but when you're working with a very large data set, this could potentially give different results based on the fact that you've got leading zeros. So how do we address leading zeros? If I go back to my data set, and I know that this is going to be one of the key columns that I'm going to use in my pivot table, I can use the trim function. What the trim function does is it will trim this field before the word, between the words, as well as at the end of the word. So in between the words, if it's got more than one space, it'll remove the unnecessary space. See, it's now once again folded all the way to the bottom. I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy this because this is my manipulating column. I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy this into my original column as a value. Let's remove our manipulating column. And if we now go back to our pivot table and we refresh our data set, we've got a different answer. So although it's still splitting it on the fact that there's some spelling errors, it's not splitting it as previously where it was seeing the words with leading characters, non-printing characters, in between at the back and in the front. It's cleared them and it's now seeing it as one single data set. So trim definitely, especially when you're working on a VLOOKUP, because remember on a VLOOKUP, Excel sees it, same as with a pivot table, it has a different value. So if I'm looking up a value and on my lookup table there's a leading zero, blanks in between or at the back, it won't see it as the actual result. So potentially your VLOOKUP, your pivot table will definitely be incorrect. Earlier we spoke about bringing in data from external data sets, which could either be in one column. And how did we address that? We said we could use text to columns. I'll go to my data. I'm going to go text to columns. I'm going to go next. I'm going to use space so that it splits this word. And now it's putting it into two separate columns so that we can get a consistency. But perhaps I would like to put this into one single column. So concatenate is a very nice feature. So I want to concatenate or combine that word as well as space and that one as well as space as well as that one. Enter. And now it's combined it. So let's do one for the bottom. So that field together with space and that field. Got an error somewhere, let's see. Oh. So text to column, to split them into different columns, concatenate, to combine them. One very important thing is while I was doing this formula, it was giving me a suggestion there. So you'll see, for me, in my formula, I use the comma inside my formula. Please always make sure if your formula, especially when you're using a formula that you've Googled or gone onto the help feature in Excel, you've found a formula, now you're trying to use that formula and it's not working for you, make sure what your format is that you use, because this is picked up by the regional settings on your machine. So the fact that I'm using a comma in between on my formula could not potentially be that it's not the right regional setting on your machine. So make sure as soon as you start using the formula, it will show you what you must use. One of the last things I'd like to show you today is the VLOOKUP feature. So sometimes as well, we might have different data sets, but due to the fact that the data sets are completely different, it's not that they just differ from a column perspective. So in the one, it's split in columns, and the other one, it's combined, or alternatively, the dates are the other way around. So the example that I used when importing bank statements from different banks, when your data set cannot be combined, but you need to create one data set based on different data sets. So you've got different details in different data sets. If you look at the bottom, if this was a different data set on a separate worksheet, and this is the data set that I'm currently populating. But for this data set, I do not have the surname. And in this data set, I do not have the leave days due. So what do I need to do? I need to create a VLOOKUP, select a common denominator between the two data sets, and then define if you find this field in this data set, bring back this value and input it on this data set. So let's quickly do this feature. So once again, this is a formula. So we're going to formula VLOOKUP. So what do I want you to look up? I want you to look up this field. I want you to look up that. Where do I want you to look it up? So if this was on a different worksheet, I would go to this different worksheet at this point. However, this is on the same worksheet, so I'm just going to select where this is. So this is where I want you to look this up. Then I'm saying if you find that specific common denominator in this data set, how many columns must you return into the original data set? So I want you to return one column, two columns. So I'm going to input 2. And if you don't find this common denominator in this data set, what must you return? You must return false. So now I've got two different data sets where I'm taking data from this data set and inputting it into my original data set to create one single data set with regards to the information. So if we look at where our VLOOKUP is, and I go to my separate data set. Remember we spoke about blanks earlier? In my separate data set, if I were now to go and insert a blank in front of my surname. Oh, that was a wonderful mistake. Not in front of my surname, because that's not our common denominator. My name is the common denominator. So you see, in the data set, especially I've increased the size now, but when you're working with a normal data set with a lot of data, you wouldn't be able to pick up that there's a difference between that and that based on is leading blank. However, now your VLOOKUP isn't working, and it's due to the fact that you've got a leading blank. So if I were now to trim, I'm going to go trim. I'm going to trim my data. Then I'm going to take my result. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste special it. Now it's removed the leading 0, and you'll see my VLOOKUP works again. So trim, especially when you've got a problem on a VLOOKUP or on a pivot table that seems like it doesn't want to work. So these are some of the key features that I've used and across the years. As I said, my most difficult one is when you're trying to combine bank statements because there's just no consistency. But using all of these features that I've just showed you, it's quite easy to get to a single data set and then to actually start analyzing the information accordingly. So thank you very much for joining today. I hope I've given you some great ideas on data. I think one of the key things is my VLOOKUP isn't working, my pivot table isn't working, and now we know where to go and look and what could potentially be the problem. So now that I'm satisfied with all of my data, I've finalized my data set, I can now actually start analyzing my data, adding in pivot tables, graphs, etc., whatever it is that I want to analyze in my data set. And if I'm now happy with my data, it means I can even go back and remove my original data worksheet or copy that I made into a different workbook because I potentially don't need it anymore. One of the other neat tricks that I've learned to do over the years is if, for instance, I'm working with a very big data set and I want to make sure continuously that I don't make a mistake and I'm not balancing. If this was, for instance, the bottom of my data set and I were to add an auto sum into my data set, so let's just make that green. A very nice little feature. Let's see where we've put it. Is under the Formulas tab. I don't know why I always assumed it should be under the Data tab, but it's under the Formulas tab, and I've got the option to create a watch window. So what will a watch window do? The field that I now select, if I now create a watch window, I'm going to add a watch, and you can create more than one. And this is telling me the spell check worksheet, K13, which is where I've added my total into. I'm going to add a watch window. Now you'll see it's showing me my value that I've got. So what I like to do because I just want to focus on that part of the watch window actually. Which means as I now work on my data set, I've continuously got a little watch window on the side. And because I know what the result is here, if anything changes in my data set, I will, no matter where I am in my worksheet, immediately see there's now a difference. Alternatively, what might be easier, especially when you're working with very big data sheets, is if we go back, we create that one, what was it, -10 or something, it's fine. If I now add a little formula that says, plus my result, -11 is 0. So let's go back to our watch window, and I'm going to create an additional watch window for 14. This now means that the result is 11, and I've added a little hidden feature in, so it's easier to make sure that we're continuously balancing to 0 at the bottom, and continuously having to remember that we need to balance to 11. So I would then actually remove the one watch, only leave the watch that shows that we're still balancing. And now as I work in my data sheet, if I apply any changes, I will immediately see I'm not balancing anymore. So as I said, that's a very nice little feature because I have worked on very big data sheets, and after the rework of the data set and the analysis, then identified somewhere along the line something went wrong and I have to redo everything. So this gives me a nice little watch no matter where I am. You don't need to have it in your data set. You can move it up and keep an eye on it right at the top, or alternatively you can keep it inside your data set, but also a very nice little feature. So thank you for joining. As I said, I hope I showed you some nice tips today, and yes, enjoy reworking, not manipulating, reworking your data so that we can get to great analysis.